And welcome to this presentation of Making Transparency Influencers, a case study of an educational approach to improve responsible AI practices in news and media. This paper is by myself, Andrew Bell, and Dr. Julia Stoyanovich, and we are both at New York University. So hopefully it's no surprise to the audience here about the critical importance of algorithmic transparency and explainability. So in the past 10 or 15 years, there's been significant concerns about the rapid proliferation of AI technologies, particularly those that are kind of complex or what is colloquially known as black box models. These black box models have been, at least in part due to their opaqueness, the cause of biased recruiting at Amazon and possibly even economic crises events like the 2010 flash crash. Importantly, researchers have made a lot of significant progress in developing methods for explainability and opening up these black boxes. So you may be familiar with methods like SHAP and LIME, and there's even metrics for evaluating how good these approaches are. However, there's one problem that the field still faces, which is how do we move from the research setting to ensuring the actual implementation of transparent AI systems in the real world? And so there's a couple answers that you might have. One of them is this idea of regulation. And while there is interest in governments around the world in regulating the transparency and opaqueness of algorithmic decision systems, in fact, over 50 different nations and IGOs have published some kind of AI strategy, action plan, or policy paper, many of which address transparency. They all kind of have one major limitation, which is that they're filled with uncertainty on how transparency should actually be implemented in a meaningful way. So if regulation at present moment isn't really handling this problem, you might think that it's the duty of private companies. But there's really, I think, some reason to doubt that companies actually care about transparency or ethical AI in general. So for example, in recent layoffs in March 2023, Microsoft actually laid off their entire responsible AI team. And just in general, there's a lot of organizational challenges to transparency. So there can be misaligned incentives, like profit motive incentives. Generally, all the ethics teams at large companies exist as a result of external pressure rather than kind of a proactive value-based decision from within. There's also human blind spots, especially at large organizations, where just because an individual cares about transparency here doesn't mean that upstream or downstream of them, there are those that care about transparency. And in general, there's a lot of research that kind of points to this need of developing better organizational tactics and stakeholder management to ensure responsible AI practices like transparency. So returning to this question, how do we move from the research setting to the actual implementation of transparent AI systems in the real world? We came up with this idea of trying to create transparency influencers. And we define transparency influencers as a type of tempered radical or a committed employee who creates institutional change over time, and those that are focused primarily on transparency. And this idea of tempered radical comes from work by Meyerson in 2006, and they kind of explain it here. The approach of tempered radicals can be very effective. In one example, over a 30-year period, a black senior executive hired an additional 3,500 women and minority members to work at a large West Coast bank as part of a covert effort to improve diversity within the company. And so in the same way, we're hoping that transparency influencers can create change towards transparency within these organizations. And so our approach was to conduct a workshop on transparency and its advocacy and try and assess how effective are we at increasing participants' literacy in the subject, and then also can we increase their willingness to conduct advocacy. And so our methods were as follows. We held a 2-hour educational workshop over Zoom. We started with 20 participants from the news, media, and journalism fields and ended with about 15. And we had a workshop that consisted of 5 modules, one of which was a role-playing activity. And we administered a pre- and post-workshop survey and also conducted semi-structured follow-up interviews. And the reason that we chose news, media, and journalism was that we held this workshop right after the release of generative AI tools like ChatGPT, and it made discussions around transparency and disclosure particularly salient for organizations in those spaces. We were also able to partner with the AI and Local News Project at the New York City Media Lab, who helped lead recruitment. So as I said, we had about 15 professionals that attended the entire duration of the workshop. And job titles included folks like the digital chief officer, audience develop editor, managing editor, and data journalist and newsroom developer. And so our workshop structure was that we had 5 different modules. They included things like talking all about the basics of transparency, talking about which tools are available, this idea of a transparency playbook, which are steps that organizations can directly take to improve the transparency of their organization. We had a breakout room activity, which I'll speak about in a moment, and then also an entire segment on becoming a transparency influencer, which means like trying to oppose common objections to transparency, like it means more costs and human capital, and it generally means sacrificing privacy. And importantly, this course is fully open source and freely available online, and it is linked in our paper. So for the breakout room activity, we actually had individuals role play those that were pro-transparency and against transparency within an organization to kind of simulate the types of arguments that might be happening. So we used Google Jamboards and had participants write down on the green cards reasons for transparency based on different stakeholders, and then on the red cards reasons against transparency for those stakeholders to kind of simulate that argument. And we had 2 important design considerations for our workshop. The first was that we actually held this as a course at CHI in 2023, where we garnered some very important feedback. So for example, including emphasis on transparency tools. And then we also made the decision to tailor the course directly to journalism. So for example, just in the months before the course came out, there was a story that broke that Kinet had been using AI to write stories. And we had some very robust discussions in the workshop about this specific example that was able to create kind of a deeper connection between the material and the audience. Unfortunately, we were unable to get enough data for the pre and post workshop surveys. So many of the participants dropped off of the Zoom call at the end and did not fill out the post workshop survey. So we weren't able to use that data. However, we were able to conduct follow-up interviews with 4 participants, 4 domain experts, one that was working in newspaper, another that was in newsroom, local TV news, and then also a researcher in this area. And we analyzed the data from these semi-structured interviews using the thematic analysis approach described by Braun and Clark. And in my remaining time, I would like to talk about some of the results that we found. So some of the major themes that have emerged from these interviews. So the first one is the frequent use of internally developed and procured algorithmic tools. So all participants mentioned that they were using some type of algorithmic tool in their work, whether it be using generative AI for creating story headlines, using recommender systems for stories, or even A/B testing story headlines. And in many cases, these were actually procured tools and not developed by the organizations themselves. We also noticed this theme of uncovering knowledge gaps. So different participants found different parts of the workshop most salient, like it could be the transparency tools or the stakeholder identification. But 3 participants literally used the phrase, they didn't know what they didn't know. And participant 3 reflected that that might actually be the reason why they're not doing as much transparency, because they don't really know what they could be doing at their organization. We also identified some organizational challenges, which kind of track with what is seen in literature. So for example, P1 stated that discussions around the use of generative AI for creating story headlines has actually like ruffled a lot of feathers within their company. And P4 mentioned that kind of in the old school local TV's newsroom mindset, there wasn't really a lot of emphasis on trying to tell people how they're using AI. But interestingly, the companies had started creating codes of conduct, and at P1, their organization came up with this idea of transparency is key to kind of include into their code of conduct for AI. There was also these kind of interesting arbitrary lines drawn on when transparency is necessary. So I'll just quickly give an example that P3 said, when our headlines are AI assisted, we don't expose that to anyone. And they went on to say that our users might not actually care. And many of the other participants kind of agreed with this, like, do we really need to tell people about headlines? The story is one thing, but just the headline itself, we can keep that to ourselves. But perhaps what's most interesting for us and what we really want to kind of make as our main takeaway were these themes related to taking action. So we identified kind of 3 types of taking action. The first one was this idea of having more conversations. So both P2 and P4 said that they had already started talking about this with colleagues. We conducted the follow-up interview 1 week after the workshop. And they said, for example, P4 said they had probably 5 more conversations about transparency, close to 0 before. P3, very interestingly, actually implemented some of the transparency tools and the stakeholder identification idea from our workshop directly into their work within the week of the workshop. So they actually did make some kind of difference there, which is like really amazing for us to hear. And then we also had one of the really interesting cases was P4 took part in an internal discussion where their company was entirely talking about AI, and they said the following. I was just in a TV workshop and I asked if we needed to be more disclosing and transparent about AI. And then it got really quiet. But then they optimistically added, it's definitely on the agenda now. So in other words, they really stepped into this role of being a transparency influencer. And so, as I said, these are the 3 different levels of transparency influencers. And I thank you for your time. And any questions can be directed to my email listed here. Thanks a lot.